Chapter 1. The Workhouse. Every city in England, large or small, has a workhouse. It is there that poor people are taken from the streets to be fed, clothed, and given tiresome work to do. They are not fed very well, only enough to keep them from dying of hunger. One stormy night, in the city it is not best to name here, a boy was born in one of these very workhouses. He was to be called Oliver Twist. Oliver was so frail that when he was born, the workhouse doctor and the shriveled old woman who attended him were surprised that he lived. His first cries were thin and faint. When his pale young mother heard them, she raised herself feebly from the bed and said in a voice that could barely be heard, "Let me hold my child before I die." The doctor quickly put the baby in her arms. She kissed his little forehead lovingly. Then she gazed around, shuddered, fell back, and died. "It's all over now, Sally," the doctor said as she prepared to leave. "Ah, poor dear, so it is," said the old woman sadly. "Such a pretty girl, too. So delicate looking," said the doctor. "She is not at all like the other women I see here. Where does she come from?" "She was found laying in the street last night," replied the old woman. "She must have been walking a long way, because her shoes were worn to pieces. But who she is or where she came from, nobody knows." The doctor shook his head sadly and said, "I wonder where the father of her child is. Perhaps he is dead too." "Ah well," he said, sighing as he put on his hat. "I must go. Good night, Sally." "Good night, sir," the old woman muttered as she bent over the body of the young mother. The new baby now screamed so loudly that his little voice filled the room. Oliver Twist grew into a pale boy. He had a sad, wistful look about him. After he was born, he was sent to a farmhouse that was really a workhouse for the homeless young children. It was run by a mean, stingy woman named Mrs. Mann. The children in her charge were always dirty and hungry. Every once in a while, one of the babies would fall from their cribs and tumble to the floor. One day, Oliver complained that he was hungry. As a punishment for this, Mrs. Mann locked him in a coal cellar. While Oliver sat in the dark on the cold stone steps, Mrs. Mann was startled to see someone she knew trying to open her garden gate. "Oh no," she said to herself, "it's Bumble from the workhouse." She pulled Oliver out of the cellar and sent him upstairs. Then she ran out, shouting, "Is that you, Mr. Bumble, sir? How glad I am to see you. The gate is locked so that none of my dear little children can wander away from me. I will open it for you in just 1 second. Do you think it proper, Mrs. Mann, to keep an officer from the workhouse waiting at your garden gate?" puffed Mr. Bumble. He was a fat man, and his face was pink and shiny after his long walk. "Oh dear, Mr. Bumble, sir. I'm sure I came just as soon as I could," Mrs. Mann replied meekly. "All right, then, let's go in," said Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Mann led him into a small parlor. Then she picked up a bottle and said with a glint in her eye, "You've had a long walk, Mr. Bumble. Would you care for a little drop of something to drink?" Mr. Bumble looked at the bottle and said, "Well, really, I shouldn't. Just a drop, Mr. Bumble," said Mrs. Mann as she began to pour. After Mr. Bumble had drained his glass, he took out a small notebook and said with great importance, "Oliver Twist is now 9 years old. Although we offered a reward for information about him, we never have discovered who his parents were." "Why, who gave him his name then?" asked Mrs. Mann. Mr. Bumble drew himself up proudly and said, "I did. We name our foundlings in alphabetical order. The one before this was S, and I named him Swubble. This was T, and I named him Twist." Mrs. Mann declared that he was very clever. "Oliver is too old to stay here now," continued Mr. Bumble. "I have come to take him back to the workhouse. Please fetch him at once." A few minutes later, Oliver was being led away by Mr. Bumble from the only home he had ever known. Oliver felt terribly sad to leave the farmhouse. He had been unhappy there, but the other children were his friends. He felt very, very alone as he struggled to keep up with Mr. Bumble's huge steps. Once inside the workhouse, Mr. Bumble handed Oliver to an old woman and left. He returned 15 minutes later to say that it was a board night, and that the board wanted to see Oliver. Now Oliver had no idea that the workhouse was run by a group of men, called the Board of Directors, so he was very surprised to hear that a board wanted to see him. When Mr. Bumble brought him into a room where 9 fat men were sitting around a table and told him to bow to the board, he looked hastily around, seeing no board except the table. Oliver decided to bow to that. "What's your name, boy?" asked one gentleman. All the men looked sternly at Oliver, which frightened him so much he could hardly speak. Then Mr. Bumble rapped him on the head with his stick. Oliver had to fight to hold back his tears. "Oliver Twist, sir," he answered in a low voice. A man in a white vest said Oliver was a fool. Another man at the table asked, "You know you're an orphan, don't you? I mean, you know of no father or mother to take care of you." "Yes, sir," replied Oliver. Tears sprang to his eyes, but he could do nothing to stop them. The first gentleman said, "You must live and work here. You will begin working tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock." Oliver bowed again and was led to a room full of hard, narrow beds. He sobbed himself to sleep. The people in the workhouse were not happy. They were hungry and miserable. They wanted to leave, but they had no money and no place to go. Because they couldn't find work, they had to stay. However, the board of directors who ran the workhouse thought the poor people there were happy. The board wanted to make it more unpleasant in order to encourage some of them to leave. Soon after Oliver left the boardroom, they decided that the people should have only half as much food to eat. For the next 6 months, Oliver worked at taking apart old ropes. The stringy fibers were separated and later used to stuff the cracks in ships to make them watertight. He and the other boys were fed 3 bowls of thin gruel a day. They became almost wild with hunger. One boy was afraid that unless he had more food to eat, he would wake up one night and find that he had eaten the boy in the bed next to him. He was big and all the boys believed him. Something had to be done. The boys met and decided that one of them should walk up to the master after supper and ask for more food. But who? They were all afraid. So a small bundle of straws were made, one of which was much shorter than the rest. Each boy would take a straw out of the bundle. Whoever drew the short straw would have to ask the master for more. One by one, the boys took their turns. Then it was Oliver's turn. His hand wavered for a moment over the straws. Should he choose this one or that? Finally, he took one, and it was the short straw. Supper time came, and the boys were led into the big stone hall, where they ate. The master stood at the front beside an enormous iron pot of bubbling gruel. The boys waited in line for him to fill their bowls. At the end of their meal, the boys whispered to one another and winked at Oliver. They nudged him with their feet. Oliver got up from the table, and with his bowl and spoon in his hands, walked toward the master. He was so hungry that he almost didn't care what happened to him. He felt reckless and very daring. Even so, he was a little surprised to hear himself say, in a voice that did not tremble, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master turned very pale. He gazed at Oliver in astonishment. The boys were frozen with fear. "What?" the master asked, blinking in disbelief. "Please, sir," repeated Oliver, "I want some more." Suddenly, the master hit him on the head with his ladle and grabbed him so that he couldn't escape, all the time screaming loudly for help. Mr. Bumble came running in, waving his cane in front of him. The directors were having another meeting when Mr. Bumble burst into the room and exclaimed, "I beg your pardon, sir, but Oliver Twist had just asked for more." The directors of the workhouse were horrified. "For more?" asked a gentleman at the head of the table. "Excuse me, Mr. Bumble, but do you mean that after he had eaten his bowl of gruel, he asked for more?" "He did, sir," replied Mr. Bumble. "I said that boy was a fool," a man in a white vest remarked proudly. "Now I say that he will most certainly hang some day." Several of the other men nodded in agreement. They ordered Oliver to be locked in a room by himself. The next morning, a sign was posted on the gate outside the workhouse. It offered a reward of £5 to anyone who would take a 9-year-old boy named Oliver Twist. In other words, any person who needed a boy to work for him could have Oliver and £5. Oliver found himself a prisoner in a dark room. At night, when it was so dark that he could not even see his own hand in front of his face, he would press against a stone wall in a strange way. The hard stone comforted him. It seemed to protect him from the black nothingness all around him and made him feel less lonely. Every morning, he was shoved under a pump and icy cold water was run over him. At supper time, he was placed on a platform in the dining hall and was beaten with a cane by Mr. Bumble. All the boys were warned that if they didn't behave, they would be punished like Oliver Twist.